Hello and welcome to the video where we're going to be talking about the Lady of Pain. Now, why am I covering a character that I've already done a video on the channel? Well, ever since I made the original version of this, probably 6 or 7 years ago now, people have been getting in touch asking me if I'll make them a version. Now, that's been quite cool because it's nice to hear from fellow Planescape fans who used to play the game back in the day, and I'm sure some still do. Now, I've made a variety of these pieces over the years for people all over the world, and the pieces sort of evolved as I've gone. So some of the earlier versions were not that accurate, still recognisable as the character, but I've been sort of honing in on the design as I've gone and making them more and more detailed as I go. Now, people obviously have been getting in touch asking me to create versions for them. And that's fine, I'm happy to do so, but there's a bit of a problem. The original versions that I've made have all been brass, and the reason I did that was because I was using patination chemicals to actually create a genuine brass patina, so actually corroding the brass as it would in the real world. And that creates some really nice colours and some really genuine looking corrosion, so there's a real benefit to making them in brass because you get that really nice effect. But the problem with that is that it actually takes quite a long time to put these together. It's quite an involved process and it takes quite a long time. So that makes it expensive. You know, if you're spending several days making an individual piece, then obviously it's going to have a price tag that reflects that. But that was a problem because the people getting in touch weren't necessarily after a brass work of art, they just wanted a memento from a game that they used to play. So it seemed to me that there was a need for me to create a version of this that was easier to produce and a bit less sort of labour intensive. So to that end, I've been creating a resin kit version basically of the Lady of Pain. It's made from the original templates that I used from the previous versions that I've made, but I've been able to add in a little bit more detail, so I'll be going through that in the video. Now, I will say straight off that if you want one of these, they are going to be available. They're going to be available as an unpainted kit form or as some painted versions as well. And for convenience, I'm going to list them on Etsy and there'll be a link in the description. But I will say that if you want to email me, I will actually be able to do a slightly better price than on Etsy, simply because if you email me directly, I won't have to pay the Etsy fees, and so obviously it can be a lower price. So if you want to do that, please do get in touch. There's a contact form on the website, so just go to the website and you'll be able to find me there. So in this video we're going to be looking at putting this together, so creating the piece, making the moulds, casting them up and then painting the final piece. So let's get started. So the first step of this is very similar to the previous version of the Lady of Pain that I made. I'm using a template here that I printed out on cardboard. Now this came from a template that I created in Adobe Illustrator, and I really just traced around an image of the Lady of Pain that I'd found online. So that gives me the basic shapes of the pieces, and I'm just cutting these out so I can use them as a template to transfer the shapes onto some acrylic sheet. And I'm just cutting out the shapes on the bandsaw. I'm getting these as close to accurate as I can, but there's going to be a lot of sanding on this, so I don't need to worry about accuracy too much. Just need to make sure there aren't huge blobs of acrylic that I need to sand away. Now, something that I couldn't do on the original version of the Lady of Pain was to add some bevels to the blades. Because that piece was made out of thin brass sheets, I think it was about like 0.6mm, there simply wasn't any dimension to the piece of metal to allow me to put that bevel in place. For these, I'm making these out of 5mm acrylic sheets, so there's much more leeway for me to actually put a bit more detail into the piece. So that's one advantage of doing this in acrylic. I mean, obviously I'm losing the ability to use patination fluids to get the genuine brass finish. But sort of swings and roundabouts here, what I can now do is put that bevel into the blades and just start adding a little bit more detail than I could previously. So here's a rough test assembly of the pieces just to get an idea of how this is going to look. And one thing I have been thinking about doing is using one of my skulls as a centerpiece for this rather than the Lady of Pain face. And happily the skulls I have are almost exactly the same shape and size as the face that I created for the original Lady of Pain, so that's kind of handy. So I think I might try and do a variant once I've got this all put together with a skull in place. So here's a cast from the original mould from the previous set of pieces I made. So it's not looking too bad, we're in the correct ballpark. So what I now need to do is start thinking about alignment, and I need to make sure the blades are all aligned correctly. So what I've been doing is using my template to glue them together in the correct orientation. Hopefully you can see on the larger blades here, I've started adding some additional detail on the surface of the blades. And this is something that I did on the later versions of the brass pieces I made. But every time I look at the picture of the Lady of Pain, I keep finding more and more detail. For a long time I was using pictures that I'd found online which were quite low res, and I could see that there was some additional detail in the background of the piece, but I couldn't really make out too well what it was. It was only a while later that I realised in the Planescape box set there's actually a Dungeon Master's screen which has a really large image of the Lady of Pain, so that was really handy once I realised I had that, because I could then refer to that to get some more of this detail. And something that I noticed is that you can see there's some additional detail on the round background piece, something that I hadn't really noticed the previous time and something that I didn't include on the original versions of the Lady of Pain. So what I've done is to cut out some styrene shapes here to try and replicate that shape. I think probably in the actual model these weren't flat against the background. I think they might have been sort of away from it, so there's a bit more dimensionality to the piece than what I'm putting in. But because we only have pictures of the model from the front, the ones that are featured on the Planescape products, I can't really tell how deep the model was, you know. So there's definitely some detail here that I haven't really picked up on purely by the fact that I only have straight on pictures to work from. However, I want to get this as accurate as I can, so I've decided to include that detail. Now, something else that I want to improve on the previous version is the face itself. What I'd sculpted was fine, you know, but I can still see there's some problems with it. It's slightly not exactly even, you know, it's slightly wonky, I think. So what I'm going to do is melt up some monster clay here and pour that into the mould that I have for the original face. Now once that's cooled down, it's going to leave me with a sculpture of the face which I can then rework and try and improve some of those problems I originally found. So what I've done is to go ahead and make a new mould of this, and I can then use that to make a new resin cast which I can then add to my new model. Okay, I'm not sure this is radically different on camera, but it certainly looks like an improvement to the eye. One of the issues I had with the original sculpture that I'd made was that the surface wasn't really smooth enough. So now that I have a resin version of the sculpture, I can now sand this down to get a smoother finish, and then sort of blend it in with the blades and everything else to try and make this one unified piece. So once I've got this in place, I can now cut down the plastic to fit the shape of the sculpture. Right, so I want to be very careful here to get the alignment correct, and so I'm using my template to make sure the blades are all correctly aligned. Once I've got this in place, I can then glue the face in place and then start blending the resin sculpture and the plastic together to make it one unified piece. I actually went back and forth on this a little bit and didn't bother filming that because there's a lot of messing about, but there's quite a lot of fine adjustments in this just to make sure everything aligns correctly. So I need to blend these two pieces together, and something I found that is it's quite tricky to add filler to a flat sort of smooth surface. It doesn't adhere very well, and what I want to do is to use some Aves epoxy to actually blend these two pieces together. So what I'm actually going to do is actually grind away some of the point where the resin and the plastic join and just create a bit of a channel that I can push epoxy into. That way it should adhere much more easily to the model, and I shouldn't have any problems with bits sliding off as I try and smooth it down. So I can now push the epoxy into the channels I've created, and I can start smoothing that out. Once it's dry, of course, I can sand it down further. Right, so here's a test assembly, and as you can see I've added a fair degree of detail on all of the blades, so they all sort of have these secondary layers of detail on them. So I've just used some thin styrene plastic to add that detail in. Now, one of the more complex sections of this build is this headpiece, and it's got several blades coming off it at a variety of angles, and it took a hell of a lot of back and forth to get the angles on this correct. So I didn't film a lot of it, but what I basically did was to file down some acrylic shapes to try and get the correct angles, and then fill in the gaps with more Aves epoxy to make a sort of a head shape. On the previous version of this, I would just do this by hand every single time, and it obviously got quite laborious, so having one piece that can do all of this is quite useful. And as you can see, the blades slot into the gaps that I've created there. Something that I also want to do is just to add a little bit more detail to this. In the original piece, it's not clear how the blades attach to the head. You know, are they just extensions of her head? You know, this is Planescape, so all the characters are very fantastical and crazy. So these could just be part of a skeletal structure maybe, but also it could be a sort of an elaborate headdress, or the whole thing could just be a statue. It's a little bit unclear what the image is, but I thought it would make sense to have some sort of, I don't know, attachment for the headdress section. So what I'm doing is just put a little bit of styrene plastic on the forehead here to suggest that there's some sort of like hat or headdress that the character is wearing to which these blades are attached. Just a little bit of extra detail. I always found when you look closely at the image on the box sets that it's a little bit bare in this area, so I just wanted to add a little bit more detail to that. Okay, so I've been back and forth on this, sanding and adding detail and trying to get this thing accurate for some time, but it can be quite difficult to see how good you've got with this because the colour of the plastic can hide some of the details and some of the imperfections. So what I'm doing is to give this a layer of primer, and once you've done that, it gives everything a flat uniform colour, and it makes it much more easy to see any of the imperfections you might have missed. Okay, now I've got this primed, I'm actually pretty happy with it. Most of the blades are sanded pretty smooth, so that's good. There's some gaps and things here which need a little bit of filling, but generally speaking this is pretty close, so I'm pretty happy with the way this is looking. And I have to say, actually, a few people when I posted this online thought this was 3D printed, so I guess that's a compliment. You know, people I think were thinking that because it looks like quite sort of accurate and sort of, you know, it's got a lot of straight edges into it, so I guess that looks like it's been designed in 3D. But obviously, as you've seen, it's all handmade, so thanks for the people who thought that. It's a bit of a compliment, so thanks. Now, one thing that I want to change is this section here. You can see I've got this curved line where I've sort of put this headdress detail in, but the area where the sort of head section actually meets the main head, there's a straight line. And it would make much more sense to me if the join was actually on that curved line rather than it being straight. So what I'm going to do is actually file that away and fill in the gap with some more epoxy. Right, there you can see we've got a gap now, so what I've done is to glue some pieces of styrene plastic in place just to give the epoxy something to adhere to. What I'm also going to do is add some Vaseline to this section. The reason I'm doing that is I don't want the epoxy to stick to this, so I'm just adding a sort of a release agent effectively. So once I push the epoxy into these gaps, it will stick to one side but not to the other, and I can just smooth that down with some water on my sculpting tool. Okay, I've left that to dry overnight, and I can now pull the piece away. That's stuck a little bit, so I'm just going to get a sculpting tool under there to try and lever it off. Right, there we go. So now, as you can see, those two sections line up nicely, and the join is now on the curve rather than being a straight line cutting directly through the head. Okay, so I think that is now done. It's looking pretty good, I think. So what I'm now going to do is come to make the moulds. And the idea for this is that they're all going to be single piece pour moulds. So what I'm going to do is effectively create a series of trays that I can pour resin into to create my casts. So what I'm going to do is take this apart and glue all of the pieces onto some flat sheets of acrylic. Obviously, silicone moulds will wear out after a certain period of time. So what I'm doing is to build these in a way that I can reuse them in the future if I need to. So what I'm doing is to add some aluminium tape around the outside of the pieces. The reason being is I'm going to glue some cardboard onto this to create some walls for my mould. But what I don't want to do is have this stuff permanently attached to the plastic. So just by adding these aluminium strips, I can peel these off once I'm done. And that should leave the acrylic sheet relatively clean. So I've cut up some strips of cardboard to create a barrier around the edges of my mould, and what I'm also going to do now is give this a layer of mould release. Something I've found previously is that occasionally the silicone can adhere to the undercoat that I've primed all of the pieces with, so just to avoid that I'm going to give them a quicker blast of mould release. You don't normally need this, to be honest with you. I rarely use it. It's just that I'm learning from experience when this has happened previously. Right, so I can now pour some silicone over my pieces. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you may notice that there's a piece of the sculpture poking out the top of the mould there. Obviously I need to deal with that, but I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, because what I'm effectively creating is a series of trays into which I'll pour my resin, I want these to be level. What you can find is that if your mould is at a slight angle, when you pour the resin in, it all sort of accumulates to one side of the mould. So you want to have them level so you don't get that. So what I've done is to just prop up a piece of wood here from beneath and made sure that this is level. So when the silicone dries, it will be level, and thus the mould will be too. I've actually been thinking about making a sort of adjustable platform where I can actually adjust the angles just to make sure that I've got a flat plane to pour against, so I might do that in the future. So now that the silicone is dry, I can now come in and deal with this problem here. As you can see, I've put some keys around the mould there on these sides. And what I'm going to be doing is pouring some plaster over this so that the mould has a flat base. So the keys will just allow me to align the pieces together. I've also got this plastic container in the centre over the piece of the sculpture that's poking through the mould. And because the silicone at this stage is partially dry, it's quite tacky, and that container is just attached to that quite nicely. So what I can now do is pour some additional silicone over that piece just to make sure it's covered. Now, as you can see, I have exactly the same problem with the face here as well. That's partially poking through the top of the mould, so I need to also top up the silicone in that area as well. So I've left these overnight and the silicone is now dry, so I can now start putting these apart. And there we go, it's come out relatively easily. There's a few sections where the silicone has crept under the pieces that were glued to the acrylic. Not too much of a problem, I can just give those a bit of a trim, but that's otherwise looking pretty good. Now, this mould, of course, I need to do a little bit more with, so I can take the plastic container away. And so what I now need to do is cover this whole area in plaster to give the mould a flat base. And what I ended up doing is actually giving that a bit of a shake to make sure that the plaster levelled off correctly. Now, I've got the same issue with this mould as well. As you can see, there's a raised section in the middle, so I need to pour some plaster over this as well to give it a flat base. So that's exactly the same operation as before. So these have all now dried, so I can now demould my pieces. Right, so there we go. So I've got 4 moulds now, and that will cover all of the pieces for the Lady of Pain model. So what I now need to do is mix up some resin and get casting. Now, obviously, I can't corrode this piece as I did with my previous Lady of Pain because it's not made of brass, it's going to be made of resin. So in order to give myself a bit of a head start, I figured I might actually tint the resin, and that should at least give me a base colour to paint against. So what I've got here is some polyurethane pigments. So I've got a green and a blue, and I'm thinking I might sort of mix these together to give some sort of base colour to the resin. Now, the thing with resin is that it actually cures to a colour on its own. You can get black and sort of off-white and white. So any colour you add to the resin will be mixed with that base colour. So although these greens and blues are quite strong, as the resin cures, it's going to go white. And so you're going to have your colour diluted somewhat. So what I'm hoping for is a sort of a pale green that I can then paint against in the final piece. So the instructions say to add the pigment to part A first, so that's what I'm doing. And I can then add in part B and start mixing that together. Okay, so let's pour this in. Now, the first cast is really a bit of an experiment, really a bit of a test, because you never know the ins and outs of a particular mould until you've cast from it a couple of times. So this is really a bit of an experiment. Now, straight away, something I realised is that I should have started casting on my flat surface that I'd prepared earlier, so I've moved my mould across. And of course on your first casting you have to sort of basically estimate how much resin you're going to need. So something that I immediately realised is that I should probably have done this in smaller batches. I think I mixed up about 400 grams of resin, which is plenty to do it, but what I actually found was that it started curing halfway through my pours. So I'd done the sort of first few moulds, but by the time I came to the third and fourth mould, the resin was well on the way to curing. So that's lesson learned for the next time I do this, do it in smaller batches, makes things a bit easier. Okay, I've left these for an hour or so and these are cured, so I can now start pulling these apart and seeing how they look. Now obviously we've got a bit of flashing around the edges, so I can just cut that away with the scalpel. But yeah, there we go. I mean, I think it's looking pretty good. On camera, I think it looks fine. To the eye, up close, there are a few issues. Like I said, because the resin started curing halfway through my pour, I've found that I'm getting some air bubbles and gaps and things in it. And it's just because the resin was quite thick when it flowed into the mould, and so there wasn't really as much opportunity for the air to escape as it came in. So yeah, casting in smaller batches I think is the way forward for this. But as a first attempt, I think that's looking pretty good, and there's nothing there that I can't correct with a bit of filler. So once that's painted up, you wouldn't know the difference. So yeah, quite happy with that. So here's some footage of my second attempt, or maybe third or fourth. I actually ended up casting a bunch of these, but you learn each time you do it, and you sort of figure out the problems with the mould and the little things you need to pay attention to. So one thing I definitely noticed is on the sharp edges of the blades, right at the ends, I was tending to get air bubbles there. I think it's just because it's a sort of a sharp corner, so the air couldn't always escape. So what I've taken to doing is using a toothpick. Once I've poured the resin in, I just scrape down the edges to make sure that the resin is fully pushed into those tight corners. And as you can see, I've got a bunch of ladies of pain here, and it's actually kind of cool to see this, because the last time I did this I made every single one of them individually from brass, and it took a while, as you can imagine. So all of these I created in I think 2 afternoons, something like that. So this probably represents, I don't know, 2 hours of casting, as opposed to something like, I don't know, 2 or 3 days of building compared to the brass ones. So yeah, much easier doing it this way, so I'm quite pleased with that. So now on to painting. Now obviously the original version of this were brass, and I used patination fluids to corrode the brass and get a genuine verdigris sort of patination effect on the brass. So all of that lovely green colour and all that randomness that you get from that process was already present on the pieces when I made them. Now these are made of resin, and so I can't do that here, so I need to paint the entire piece. Now although 90% of the original version of this was genuine corrosion, the face itself was still made of resin, and so I still needed to paint that. And I would also sort of touch up the patination. One thing with patination that you can tend to find is that sometimes it isn't that sort of vibrant. It can look quite dull in places, so I would often sort of touch up the patination here and there, just to sort of give it a bit more sort of I don't know, contrast almost, and just to make it sort of stand out a little bit more, and also to blend it in with the paint job that I'd done on the face. So I do have some experience of painting verdigris and sort of trying to match that together, so I'm not sort of starting from scratch here. Nevertheless, I am sort of finding my way with it. So what I'm doing is taking a bunch of different colours and just sort of randomly putting them onto the resin. I was worrying that I might need to actually undercoat this and prime it, which would sort of take away the green colour that I already have. I don't think you can buy green primer, possibly you can, but they don't sell it where I am. So I was sort of slightly worrying that I might end up losing this base green colour that I have, but I've actually found that the paint adheres to the resin really well, and I gave it a bit of a test by scratching it with my thumbnail, and it didn't seem to want to come off, so that's pretty good. So I'm happy to proceed without a undercoat here. So what I'm doing is to put the colours onto the base, but then I'm adding loads and loads of this thinner. This is the X20 thinner from Tamiya. Works really well with acrylic colours. What I want is for the colours to flow together in a sort of a semi-random fashion. This is, after all, what would happen with the patination. You know, the reaction would happen, but I would put tons and tons of patination fluid onto the metal, and that would mean that it would sort of run together, and if you had areas of blue or areas of green, they would sort of blend together in quite a natural way. So what I'm trying to do is to replicate that effect here with the paint and the thinner. Now, as with the casting, my first go is a bit of an experiment really, so I'm just trying to figure out how to do this, but I'm quite pleased with how this is looking initially. I've got a fair degree of randomness to it. I think the key to it really is trying not to make it look too artificial. You want these curves and these blends to look quite natural. I think it's quite difficult for us to do things deliberately in a random fashion, so I'm just trying to take in my time and trying to make sure that this all looks pretty natural. Now, a key thing with the original Lady of Pain is the contrast between the blues and the greens of the brass corrosion and the reds of the sort of rust corrosion. Now, I guess, I mean, obviously this is a fancy character, but it sort of implies that it's made from a variety of metals, you know, the main metal being brass, but there must be some iron in there because you've got this red corrosion as well. So I'm trying to replicate that by using some weathering powders. These are Humbrol weathering powders. They've got these very nice sort of bright oranges. I've also got some oil colours in there as well, and what I'm trying to do is to drip these down with some white spirit. Now, the colours I've used for the greens and blues are acrylic, but the base for the weathering powders and the oils are using white spirit as a thinner. So the two paints don't mix together and shouldn't interact. So that means I can put a red layer on top of the blue and green without worrying about it affecting that layer. So what I'm trying to do is just drip these down and sort of again get a very natural effect to the way that the paint's flowing. I can now use the same technique on the blades as well. I can now use the same technique that I established for the base to paint the blades and the rest of the piece. Now, something that I established on my version of the Lady of Pain, which isn't featured in the original, is this idea of the corrosion sort of leaking down from her eyes and looking a little bit like tears. I quite like that look, so I'm just trying to drip some brown oil paint down from the eyes to get that sort of streaky look. I'm also coming in with some additional brown, sort of browny red oil paints and just adding some additional corrosion to the blades. The idea here is really just to sort of break up the overall colour. I think it looks a bit too samey if it's all blue and green, so adding some browns and reds in there adds a nice contrast and just gives a bit of a variety to the paint job. So there we go, so I'm quite happy with that. The thing is with this one though is that this is really a painted version of one of my Ladies of Pain, and if you look at here's a picture of the original, you can see that it's fairly similar. It's got that sort of blue-green colour scheme. But if we look at a picture of the original character, as you can see there's actually quite a lot more rust on this, like i.e. sort of browny reds, than there is on mine. So what I decided to do was do a version which was a slightly more closer to the original D&D version. So to that end I'm using some more oil paints and some more weathering powders to add more rust to the base of this version. And as you can see I'm dripping some thinned down oil paints on here, and that's being thinned down with white spirit. What I can then do is come in with a hairdryer and just give that a blast, and that sort of does two things. It flashes off the thinner and dries the paint much quicker, but it also causes the paint to drip down, sort of blow it around the place, and that I think gives quite a natural look to the way that's dripping down. So that's quite cool. So I'm just sort of having fun experimenting really with trying to get sort of random patterns on this. Right, so here's the two versions side by side. As you can see, it's just a different look to the same character really. I'm not sure which one I prefer really, but they both look pretty cool. Right, so there we go. So it's actually been quite a fun project revisiting this. Obviously, as I've said in the video, there's a bit of sort of swings and roundabouts with this. While it's much easier now for me to create these, I don't have to solder brass together or do any of that business. I do lose a bit of time actually doing the paint job because I can't corrode the brass, and so I've got to paint that. So swings and roundabouts really, but it's been quite fun painting these. And obviously I'm going to be creating more as I go. So I think that's it for this one. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to support the channel, then please do give us a like and subscribe and all the usual YouTube stuff. The more concrete way of supporting the channel is heading over to my Etsy store, which is the Sculpture Studio, where I have a variety of skull-based sculptures for those who are interested in such things. If you'd like to follow what I do, I'm also on Instagram and Facebook. Just search for The Dark Power.